She was born into silence, not the kind that comforts, but the kind that judges. A silence polished like marble, perfumed with beeswax and money, where every glance was a command and every word a risk. Edith Wharton came into the world wrapped in velvet expectations, taught before speech that good women did not argue, did not create, did not exist too loudly. She was told to sit straight, to smile softly, to vanish beautifully. But beneath that composure, something restless waited, a mind that refused to be embalmed in manners. They thought they were raising a lady. They were building a weapon. In the drawing rooms of old New York, she learned that truth was impolite, that imagination was unbecoming, that the most dangerous thing a woman could do was think. So she did it in secret. And when they burned her first story, she memorized the smoke. Before we dive deeper into this unforgettable video, make sure to like the video, subscribe to our channel, and hit the bell icon. That way you'll never miss any new coming videos like this. Now let's get back to it. She grew up in rooms where the air itself was trained to behave. Gaslight flickered against silk curtains, portraits of ancestors watched with powdered disapproval, and conversation moved like porcelain, delicate, rehearsed, breakable. Her mother never shouted. She didn't need to. One raised eyebrow could silence a room. One sigh could erase a thought. Edith learned early that affection could be withheld as efficiently as breath. Her father adored beauty, architecture, art, the measured perfection of Europe. But his love was distant, a whisper through walls. To be a daughter in such a house was to be a ghost that smiled on command. Servants padded through corridors in soft shoes, and somewhere in the hush of chandeliers, a small girl rehearsed sentences she'd never be allowed to say. At 5, she began to tell stories to the only person who listened. Her nurse, Doily, an Irish woman with calloused hands and a kindness that smelled of starch and lavender. Edith would dictate fairy tales, while Doily wrote them down on scraps of brown paper. The stories were strange, alive, too vivid for the parlor world that bred her. One day her mother found them. The paper was taken, the words read aloud at dinner for amusement, and then gone, burned in the grate, like something shameful. Edith smiled as expected. She would remember that sound forever, paper curling into silence. That night she promised herself something she didn't yet have words for, that what they destroyed she would one day rebuild in ink no flame could touch. To understand her, you have to understand her city. New York in the 1860s was a theater of restraint. Outside, the nation bled through civil war. Inside, its brownstone society drew the curtains tighter. Wealth was worshipped, but discretion was divine. Men built empires, women curated illusions. Every gesture was a performance. To exist was to obey the choreography, the morning call, the carriage ride, the quiet cruelty of comparison. It was a world that measured worth not by soul, but by surface. And in that world, a girl who wanted to write was an offense against architecture. Literature was for men. Women decorated the margins. But Edith's imagination refused to stay ornamental. She began to write in her head, whole conversations, betrayals, marriages, cracking beneath etiquette. She couldn't name it yet, but she was already dissecting the Gilded Age before it existed. Her mother, Lucretia, mistook this inner life for rebellion. To her, emotion was vulgarity and intellect a social hazard. When she caught Edith performing a play she'd written for her dolls, she stopped her mid-gesture. "Don't make faces," she said. "It's unbecoming." That was all. No punishment, just the verdict of a civilization. Restraint was grace, expression was failure. From that day, Edith began to train her face into composure. She discovered that stillness was its own disguise. The quieter she became, the more invisible she was, and invisibility was freedom. Behind lowered lashes, she studied everything: the tremor of envy in a hostess's smile, the false humility of a beau, the exhaustion hidden under beauty. She was collecting ammunition disguised as manners. Her father, George Frederick Jones, offered gentleness without spine. He read Horace, admired Palladian facades, and believed the world ran on propriety. His affection was polite, his absence constant. He would never tell his daughter that her mind mattered. He simply never noticed that it did. Yet from him she inherited a love of order, the architecture that would later shape her sentences like carved cornices, every word measured against symmetry. Where her mother taught her silence, her father taught her structure. From both, she learned the grammar of captivity. When the family fled post-war New York for Europe, officially for her father's health, unofficially to escape the humiliation of lost fortune, Edith found what she'd been missing. Air, Florence, Rome, Paris, cities that breathed art without apology. She wandered marble corridors, listened to fountains speak in Latin, touched walls older than her family's name. She understood beauty as survival. In Europe, imagination wasn't shameful. It was currency. She began to tell stories again, this time to herself, long narratives whispered under breath as she walked through echoing halls. She would later say that was when she first felt alive. The past, she wrote, was not history. It was atmosphere, and she inhaled it whole. But even paradise had rules. Her mother disapproved of foreign freedoms. French women spoke too freely. Italians gestured too much. Art was dangerous if it suggested emotion. Edith learned to hide again. Yet the damage was done, or perhaps the salvation. The world had cracked open. She had seen color, texture, ruin, form, the raw materials of future novels. She didn't yet know she would one day build her own literary house out of the debris of this trip. For now, she was still a child memorizing light. But memory, she would later discover, could be its own rebellion. At 9, she almost died. Typhoid, a fever that dragged her between worlds. The doctors plunged her into ice baths while she screamed. She learned early that pain, when endured silently, impressed adults. Her mother stayed away from the sick room. Doily held her hand. Afterward, Edith changed. She began to observe her own thoughts as if they belonged to someone else. That distance, that eerie ability to stand outside herself, would one day become her style. Detached, precise, devastating. The fever broke, but the detachment never did. She emerged thinner, quieter, already watching life through glass. When the Joneses returned to New York, the city had changed, or maybe she had. The brownstone on 23rd Street seemed smaller, dimmer, as though it had shrunk to fit its own vanity. She had left a child and returned a witness. The parlors felt airless, the laughter brittle. The same names echoed: Rhinelander, Astor, Livingston, people embalmed in their own importance. Edith felt the falseness instantly. Beauty without soul, ceremony without meaning. Her Europe had been alive, New York was taxidermy. She was too young to explain it, but she felt it everywhere, in the clinking china, the rehearsed courtesies, the way servants disappeared before they were noticed. She began to sense what she would later expose, that under the velvet of the Gilded Age lay rot. At night she dreamed of writing, though she didn't yet have a word for ambition. She only knew that stories pressed against her ribs, demanding air. She wrote them on napkins, in the margins of hymnals, on the backs of envelopes, always in secret. Her family prized silence, but silence had turned traitor. It whispered to her instead of punishing her. It said, "Remember this. Remember how they smile when they mean to wound. Remember how elegance can suffocate. Remember how beauty can lie." She did. Every suppressed feeling, every swallowed word became a stone in the foundation of the writer she would become. She would grow into a woman who turned drawing rooms into battlefields, who exposed the cruelty hidden inside manners, who taught the world that politeness could kill as effectively as a blade. But for now, she was still a girl in a too-quiet house, learning to breathe under brocade, hiding her defiance in perfect posture. The Gilded Age was still waiting to be written, and she would be the one to write it, not as ornament, but as indictment. She began to understand that silence could be armor, but it could also be a cage. Every time she entered a drawing room, she could feel its invisible architecture closing in, the chandelier above her like judgment, the polished piano waiting to be played but never touched, the scent of tea and money in the air. The women glided like ghosts, trained to nod at the right jokes and blush at the right silences. Edith watched them, fascinated and horrified. She could already sense the danger of becoming one of them, perfect, decorative, hollow. They moved as if the floor itself might shatter if they stepped too loudly. Their laughter was rehearsed, their grief choreographed. She promised herself that if she ever broke, it would be real. By 16, she was writing secretly. Poems at first, neat, moral verses, their surfaces as polished as the mirrors she despised. She slipped them under her mattress, knowing if her mother found them, they'd be dismissed as fancies. When she finally sent one anonymously to a magazine, she did it with a trembling hand and a fake name. A month later, she found it printed in the back pages of The Atlantic, her words between sermons and sea shanties, signed only with initials. She didn't tell anyone. No one asked. At dinner, her mother discussed fabrics. Her father recited Latin. Edith sat in silence, a secret burning in her chest. Her voice had escaped the house, and no one had noticed. For the first time, that invisibility felt like freedom. But freedom has a price. The same year she was presented to society, debuted like fine porcelain. She was dressed in white, corseted, powdered, and released into the shimmering choreography of New York's elite. The season was a blur of ballrooms and carriage rides, of men bowing and women whispering behind gloved hands. She smiled when required, danced when asked, and felt nothing. Inside the music and mirrors, she saw the machinery of her own entrapment, the endless repetition of roles, the illusion of choice. Every compliment was a transaction, every glance a negotiation. She watched herself from a distance, as though she were already writing the scene she was living. Later she would say that her education had been purely ornamental, designed to make her agreeable, not alive. The truth was simpler. She had been trained to disappear beautifully. Then came the engagement. His name was Harry Stevens, a man with a good family, good manners, and no imagination. He liked horses, travel, and women who didn't ask questions. He told her she was different, that she thought too much, that her eyes were too serious. He said it like a compliment, and she smiled as if she believed him. They walked through Newport gardens, discussed trivial things, and wrote polite letters. It was the kind of courtship that felt more like rehearsal than desire. Her mother approved. The families matched. It should have been perfect. But something inside Edith recoiled. It wasn't Harry she dreaded. It was the silence she would be forced to share with him for the rest of her life. The engagement broke off quietly. No one said why. Some claimed she changed her mind. Others whispered that he had. The truth died in discretion, like everything else in her world. But afterward, something hardened in her. She stopped waiting to be chosen. She stopped apologizing for wanting something unnamed. The humiliation was private, but it was enough. She turned inward, not as retreat but as rebellion. If she couldn't be free in her life, she would be free in her mind. That winter, she began filling notebooks again. Observations, dialogues, ideas. She studied architecture, gardens, proportion, not as hobbies, but as languages of control. I wanted, she wrote later, to arrange the world so that it could not crush me. She was beginning to build something invisible but unbreakable. Her mother noticed the change. Edith had grown too quiet, too watchful. She corrected her posture, her tone, her sentences. Don't analyze people, she said. Once over tea, it isn't kind. But analysis was how Edith breathed. Every room she entered became a novel in progress. Every face hid a chapter. She didn't see people anymore. She saw structure, consequence, tragedy waiting behind etiquette. It was both gift and curse. When others gossiped about who had worn the wrong color, Edith was studying the emotion behind the error, envy, insecurity, hunger. She began to realize that society wasn't a hierarchy. It was a performance, and the best performers were the ones who believed their own lies. She continued writing under pseudonyms. Her poems appeared in magazines read by the very people who ignored her at dinner. Her family didn't know. They didn't need to. Her rebellion was quiet, invisible, devastating. Words became her inheritance, the one currency no man could manage, no mother could dictate. She edited herself relentlessly. Each line had to carry weight. Her prose when she began writing short stories was clean, restrained but alive with pressure. She wrote about drawing rooms that suffocated, about women whose kindness destroyed them, about marriages that looked perfect until someone spoke. She didn't call it feminism. She called it accuracy. In the late 1880s, her father fell ill. His fortune faded with him. They traveled again, as they always did when life became inconvenient. Italy, Switzerland, Paris. She was 23 now, beautiful in a severe way, too intelligent for comfort. Men flirted with her out of curiosity, not conviction. Women admired her handwriting, but not her opinions. One evening in Florence, at a dinner among exiled Americans, someone asked what she did all day. "I write," she said simply. The table fell quiet. "How interesting," another woman murmured. Edith smiled. They thought she was joking. She never corrected them. She had learned long ago that disbelief could be its own protection. When her father died, she inherited money but lost direction. She was now, by every definition, successful, wealthy, unmarried, educated, and utterly alone. The loneliness didn't frighten her. The stagnation did. She had escaped one kind of cage only to find another. New York was still a world of drawing rooms, and she was still the girl who couldn't breathe in them. The difference now was that she knew why. Society wasn't a social club. It was a machine that turned women into decoration. She had spent her life polishing her own chains, but knowledge without action is torment. She needed to do something with it. In the spring of 1885, she married Edward Robbins Wharton, Teddy. He was charming, kind, and comfortably shallow. A man who loved dogs, sailing, and the illusion of peace. He had no interest in art, none in her writing, but he smiled at her seriousness the way one smiles at a clever child. She mistook that smile for safety. They honeymooned in Europe, her second home, his playground. He fished. She wrote. He laughed with friends. She watched them turning gestures into sentences. It wasn't love. It was a truce. He gave her freedom to write because he didn't believe it meant anything, and in that small underestimation, he set her free. Marriage didn't quiet her mind. It sharpened it. In the still hours between dinners and visits, she began to write in earnest, short stories about women trapped in polite tragedies, about men who mistook compliance for virtue. She studied interiors, not for beauty, but for metaphor. The arrangement of furniture, the play of light, the symmetry of rooms, all of it spoke to her. She realized that houses, like marriages, were prisons built from taste. The very decor her society prized was what confined them. The decoration of houses, she would later write, is the decoration of minds. She was already sketching her rebellion, one sentence at a time. But rebellion is lonely work. Teddy's cheerfulness began to curdle into distance. He teased her about her books, called her the genius with a smirk that left bruises where no one could see. When she published her first architectural essays, he congratulated her like one might a child for finishing a puzzle. She smiled back, but inside she was retreating into pages, into solitude, into control. She had married to escape one silence, and found herself in another. Yet this one was hers. She could shape it. She could fill it with meaning. The girl who had been silenced by her mother was now writing the world that had silenced them both, and she had only just begun. She woke before dawn, when the house was still, and the only sound was the hiss of the radiator. The mornings belonged to her. While the servants stirred downstairs and Teddy slept through the pale light, Edith sat at her desk and began to build worlds. Her handwriting was disciplined, her ink deliberate. Each word had to earn its place, each sentence built like architecture, measured, balanced, and alive. She wasn't trying to impress anyone anymore. She was trying to breathe. Writing had become not her escape, but her only form of honesty. The drawing rooms of her youth had taught her how to observe without speaking. Now she turned that gift into art. She wrote about what she had seen all her life, polite cruelty, social obedience, the moral decay hidden under chandeliers. Her stories were sharp and bloodless, the kind that made people uncomfortable without knowing why. Critics would call her prose cold. It wasn't cold, it was precision mistaken for detachment. She had learned early that if you want to survive among the polite, you must hide your blade in charm. Her life became a performance of stability. She hosted dinners, smiled for photographs, nodded through conversations about other people's art, other people's scandals. She played her role to perfection, even as she was dismantling the stage beneath her. At night, she read Henry James, Balzac, Flaubert, the masters of the quiet catastrophe. She admired their control, their restraint, their ability to slice through society with a whisper. But she wanted something they couldn't give her, the woman's perspective from inside the cage, not the observer, the prisoner. Her stories began to take that shape. Women in beautiful rooms that felt like coffins, husbands whose kindness was a form of exile, love that looked like civility. She wrote as if confession could be disguised as commentary, and somehow it worked. By her 30s, Edith Wharton was publishing regularly in magazines. Her name, at first hidden behind initials, began to appear in full. The same social circles that once dismissed her as the clever Mrs. Wharton now quoted her stories at luncheons, unaware she was writing about them. It delighted her in a quiet, dangerous way. They read her like entertainment. She was writing them like an obituary. When The Decoration of Houses was published in 1897, co-written with her friend Ogden Codman, critics called it a charming guide to domestic taste. What they didn't see was that it was a declaration of independence. Her essay on proportion read like a philosophy of survival. A well-made room, she wrote, must contain nothing superfluous. She wasn't talking about furniture, she was talking about life. That same year, she stood on a wild slope of land in Lenox, Massachusetts, staring at the skeleton of a dream. The wind cut through her coat, sharp with the scent of pine and snow. Around her, the hills rolled in quiet perfection, and she saw it, her sanctuary, her experiment, her fortress, the Mount. A house built by her own mind, not her husband's money or her mother's taste. Its blueprints were an act of rebellion disguised as symmetry. Every window, every corridor, every stairwell followed her command. There would be no velvet suffocation, no ornamental excess, no echoes of her childhood home's funereal quiet. The Mount would be air, light and order, a place where she could exist without apology. I wanted, she wrote later, a house where I could think. When it was finished in 1902, it was more than a home. It was a manifesto in stone. At the Mount, she began to live the life she had once only written about. The mornings were for work, the afternoons for long walks with her dogs, the evenings for letters, reading, and thought. Her study overlooked the Berkshire Hills, and in that room she wrote like someone finally given permission to breathe. Teddy roamed the grounds, affable and restless, collecting hobbies to distract himself from her growing distance. He rode horses, gambled, complained about bills. Edith, with quiet elegance, handled it all. They lived side by side like two parallel lines, never intersecting, never colliding, just coexisting in a polite geometry of estrangement. But still, she did not stop building. Stories poured from her. The Greater Inclination, her first collection, was published in 1899. It sold modestly, but drew attention. Then came The Touchstone, Sanctuary, The Valley of Decision. Each book was a brick in the monument she was constructing to herself. Her characters spoke in the language of her upbringing, soft, precise, lethal. She turned the manners of the elite into a kind of weapon. To the world, she was a society woman, dabbling in literature. In truth, she was chronicling its autopsy. She entertained carefully. Her dinner parties were quiet masterpieces, measured conversations, candlelight balanced just right, the silver gleaming like punctuation marks. Henry James became a regular guest. They shared a bond deeper than friendship, mutual recognition. He saw her precision. She saw his loneliness. They spoke not as novelist and admirer, but as equals, two minds too refined for the noise around them. He told her once, half joking, "You are the only woman who knows how to write a sentence." She smiled, but didn't answer. She knew the compliment came wrapped in envy. The mount became her mirror, but also her test. Control was her god, and she worshipped through work. She dictated pages to her secretary while pacing the library. Her voice measured and unwavering. Her manuscripts bore few revisions. She wrote like an architect draws, clean lines, exact proportions, no wasted motion. But beneath that discipline was hunger. She had not been loved in years. Teddy's affection had eroded into indifference, his charm into irritability. He mocked her intellect because it frightened him. He laughed at her seriousness because it made him small. When she spoke of ideas, he changed the subject. When she fell silent, he called her moody. He could not see that she had already left him, not in body but in spirit. The marriage decayed quietly, elegantly, like everything else in her world. They no longer touched. They rarely spoke, except through the gentle diplomacy of servants. He spent extravagantly. She paid the bills. He grew unpredictable, slipping into depression, then mania, then charm again. She managed it all with grace, hosting when required, smiling when expected, pretending when necessary. But at night, in her study, she wrote the truth, stories about polite cruelty, invisible despair, and the cost of composure. She had mastered the art of turning pain into prose. Her readers called her insightful. They didn't know they were reading her diary. The more she wrote, the less she belonged. New York society still admired her name, but not her gaze. She saw too much. Her success made her dangerous, not adored. Invitations thinned. Friends withdrew. She didn't mind. "There is one path alone," she wrote, "on which none may accompany us, the path to the heart of our own work." And she walked it without hesitation. Each book cut closer to bone, and each year she felt less need to disguise her truth behind etiquette. She wasn't merely describing her world, she was dismantling it, one sentence at a time. But the foundation was shifting. Teddy's moods grew darker, his debts multiplied. He began accusing her of betrayal, imaginary lovers, hidden motives, whispered plots. His paranoia frightened her, but she refused to show it. She had survived her mother's control, her father's distance, society's mockery. She would survive this too. Yet even Edith could not deny the tremor under her life. The house that symbolized her freedom was beginning to feel like a mausoleum. The symmetry that once soothed her now mocked her. She would walk through the halls at dusk, watching the light dissolve against the walls and think, perfection is just another kind of prison. And somewhere in the back of her mind, a new story began to form, a story about a woman destroyed not by scandal, but by silence. A woman named Lily Bart. The mornings became ritual. Before anyone in the house woke, she slipped into her study, pulled the curtains halfway to catch the pale light, and began to write. The desk was arranged like a map of her mind, ink bottle to the left, letters stacked by size, pages aligned as if order itself could steady her. Writing was no longer leisure, it was survival. Each sentence was a brick in the invisible structure that kept her from collapsing. She built carefully, obsessively, the way her father once admired architecture, everything proportioned, balanced, obedient to rhythm. But unlike the rooms she had grown up in, these constructions breathed. She wrote about women who obeyed too well, men who mistook control for love, and drawing rooms that hummed with unspoken cruelty. Her prose was clean as frost, and just as dangerous. Readers called it refined. They didn't realize refinement was her disguise. Beneath the calm, every story trembled with fury. She had learned to weaponize politeness. Each paragraph cut without raising its voice. The same elegance her mother had demanded now served her rebellion. She was no longer the girl silenced in the parlor. She was the woman describing the silence, sentence by sentence, until it confessed. Outside her study, the performance continued. Newport in summer, Lenox in autumn, carriages, dinners, guests. Teddy laughed loudly, drank generously, spent freely. He loved dogs, cards, and anything that filled the silence between them. He called her the genius in company, with that faint edge of mockery that men use when admiration feels like threat. Edith smiled, always composed, as if his smallness could not touch her. But in private, the air between them thinned. His mood shifted like weather, bright one day, sullen the next, resentful of what he couldn't name. She began to sense the truth. She would later write again and again that affection without comprehension is another form of solitude. Then came the house. In 1897, on a slope of tangled Berkshire land, she imagined freedom in the shape of symmetry. The Mount, a name that sounded like authority, permanence, faith. She designed it herself, every angle, every column, every doorway, measured to her exact sense of proportion. There would be light, she said, and air. No velvet heaviness, no ornamental suffocation. The house would be a mind made visible. She oversaw everything, the layout of the terrace, the slope of the stairs, the curve of the drive. A well-made house, she told a friend, is like a well-made sentence, nothing unnecessary. When the walls finally rose white and perfect against the hills, she felt something close to relief. She had built her first true sentence in stone. At the Mount, she wrote as if she'd been waiting her whole life for quiet. Mornings belonged to her pages, afternoons to her gardens, evenings to the long shadows across the hills. The world outside her gates kept spinning, but inside the symmetry she'd designed, time moved by her command. Here she could think without permission. Here she could hear herself. The isolation was deliberate, but it wasn't peace. It was control. She had mistaken order for happiness before. She was determined not to again. Visitors came, writers, politicians, the occasional curious neighbor. Henry James arrived often, drawn by her precision and her humor. Their conversations lasted hours, dense with irony and affection. He called her "Dear Mrs. Wharton" and teased her for her discipline. She called him "Dear Master" and teased him for his fussiness. Between them was an unspoken kinship. Two minds shaped by exile from ordinary feeling, two artists who hid emotion beneath craftsmanship. "You write," he once told her, "like a man of the world." She replied, "Perhaps the world made me one." He laughed, but she meant it. By 40, she was publishing regularly. The Greater Inclination, The Touchstone, Sanctuary. Her name, no longer hidden behind initials, appeared in every review column worth reading. The same women who once mocked her seriousness now quoted her at luncheons. They didn't realize she was writing their epitaphs. To them, her stories were clever morality tales. To her, they were dissections of their hypocrisy. The Gilded Age had always been her subject, because it had been her wound. Teddy drifted further from her with each success. He slept late, spent more, smiled less. He filled the stables with new horses, the cellar with expensive wine, the house with silence. At dinners, he interrupted her mid-sentence, not to correct her but to remind her that he could. She never argued. She had grown up with that tone. It no longer bruised, yet she felt a new kind of loneliness, the kind that comes not from absence, but from presence that refuses to see you. She wrote through it, turning humiliation into structure. "Life," she said once, "is the most dangerous art form." By 1900, her stories had become surgical, each one carved closer to bone. Critics admired her precision, called her the American disciple of Henry James. She accepted the comparison, but she was already moving beyond it. James wrote about conscience. She wrote about confinement. He dissected morality. She dissected decorum. She was finding her own voice, cool, unsentimental, mercilessly clear. Beneath the refinement was a single question that would define her life. What happens to a woman who can see the truth and has nowhere to put it? The Mount glittered on the surface, dinners, dogs, laughter echoing down polished corridors. But she began to sense decay in its perfection. Teddy's cheerfulness grew erratic, his accounts unsteady. There were whispers of mood swings, debts, letters misplaced, servants dismissed without reason. She managed it quietly, paid what had to be paid, hid what had to be hidden. Control had always been her religion, and she practiced it with grace. But late at night, when the house slept, she walked the corridors and listened. The walls felt too symmetrical, the silence too complete. It was beautiful, but beauty, she was learning, could suffocate as effectively as shame. One evening, she stood by her study window and watched the lights of Lenox flicker in the distance. The sky was a deep iron blue. Somewhere, a dog barked once and fell silent. She realized she had everything her world said a woman should want: wealth, position, recognition, and yet all she could feel was the pressure of her own composure. She thought of the girl she had been, whispering stories into the dark, and understood that the child had written for freedom, while the woman was writing for proof. That night she began sketching notes for a novel that would strip the Gilded Age of its glamour, that would show the violence hidden in its grace. She would call the heroine Lily Bart, a woman who mistakes beauty for safety and pays the price. It would be the book that made her famous and the one that broke her heart. But standing in the quiet room at the Mount, Edith Wharton only knew that the world she was about to expose was the same one that had made her. The age of manners was about to meet its reckoning, and its executioner was sharpening her pen. When the House of Mirth arrived in 1905, the city that once ignored her trembled. Reviewers called it magnificent, tragic, merciless. It sold 30,000 copies in 3 weeks, a phenomenon whispered across drawing rooms and editorial offices alike. Edith watched from a careful distance, expression steady, pen still. To the public, she was serene. Privately, she felt flayed. They thought she had written a scandal. She knew she had written a confession. Lily Bart, that beautiful ghost of a woman destroyed by her own good breeding, was not invention. She was anatomy, of silence, of obedience, of the price a woman pays for being looked at and not known. Edith had spent her life perfecting control. Now she had exposed the cost of it. At luncheons, women praised the novel for its accuracy. They said they recognized Lily. They did not realize they were recognizing themselves. Men admired the structure, the masculine restraint. Edith smiled and let them. She knew what they meant, that her precision frightened them. She listened to their compliments like eulogies, and returned home to write in the margins of her own book. They mistake death for dessert. The success should have felt like triumph. Instead, it felt like exposure. She had opened the doors of the grand house and let the rot show. Teddy, meanwhile, called her the famous Mrs. Wharton with a smirk that never quite reached his eyes. He drank more, rode less, grew heavy with resentment. He wanted her brilliance dimmed, her attention reclaimed. He began to spend money she didn't have, then blamed her for his debts. She covered the losses quietly, arranging their finances the way she arranged sentences, neat, precise, without affection. When guests asked about his health, she said he was resting. When they asked about her happiness, she said she was working. It was the same answer, really. Work had become the only place she still existed, without translation. She fled often to Paris now, claiming research, though what she sought was air. Europe still remembered her kindly, an American novelist with taste, elegance, no scandals worth printing. In Paris she walked through the Luxembourg Gardens with notebooks tucked beneath her arm, studying gestures, conversations, shadows. "The world is made of surfaces," she wrote, "and the writer's task is to see through them politely." The French understood her. Americans wanted warmth. She gave them clarity. Henry James visited again, delighted by her triumph, though secretly wary of its scale. The pupil had eclipsed the master. "My dear," he told her, "you have become the very embodiment of your subject." She laughed, but the compliment unsettled her. He meant she was the world she dissected, and perhaps he was right. She had built her art out of the very manners she despised. By the winter of 1906, the Mount no longer felt like sanctuary. The house echoed with a husband's silences and a writer's ghosts. Teddy had begun accusing servants of theft, then forgot what he'd accused them of. He misplaced letters, burned receipts, paced the halls muttering about betrayal. She handled it as she handled everything, grace first, panic later, and only in private. But one night she found a pistol beneath his pillow. That was when the last illusion fell away. The man she'd married because he was kind was now a stranger, and she had no vocabulary for madness except fiction. She traveled to Italy, to London, to the Riviera, anywhere that wasn't home. On trains she wrote in fragments, the outlines of a new novel, The Fruit of the Tree, about guilt, mercy, and the moral mathematics of compassion. It was meant to be about factory reform and euthanasia. Really, it was about escape. Her critics said it lacked feeling. They couldn't have known she'd written it in rooms where she slept alone, in a marriage that was evaporating quietly like perfume. Then, in Paris he appeared. Morton Fullerton, Oxford educated, immaculately dressed, half English, half myth. A journalist with eyes like unspoken promises. He had the sort of confidence that moves through rooms without apology. They met at a dinner, exchanged politenesses, then letters. The letters became conversations. The conversations became need. He admired her mind without fear, read her sentences the way a lover reads skin. For the first time, she felt truly seen, not as a wife, not as an ornament, but as an intellect that burned. "You have made me feel everything," she wrote to him, "and made everything else seem flat." They began an affair conducted in ink, then in whispers, then in rooms. She was 45, newly alive and already doomed. He was a collector of affections, fluent in vanishing. She knew it and didn't care. For once, she allowed herself to be reckless. The letters between them were a secret novel, pages of confession, passion, despair. She wrote of hunger, of fear, of freedom. He replied with charm that glittered and cut. For a while, the affair made her incandescent, then it made her ill. Fullerton drifted. His replies slowed. Rumors reached her. Other women, perhaps men, the usual evasions. She confronted him not with rage but with sentences. "You are a man," she wrote, "to whom nothing matters, but I mattered once." He didn't answer. She kept writing anyway, because that's what she did with pain. She gave it form. Out of that ruin came Frome, a novel of snow, silence, and suffocation. Critics thought it a rural tragedy. They didn't realize it was her own. The frozen New England landscape was the inside of her marriage, the paralysis of decency, the cold she had lived in for years. Teddy's decline accelerated. He grew erratic, paranoid, sometimes cruel, sometimes childlike. He sold investments, mislaid fortunes, accused her of conspiracies he couldn't explain. At night he wandered the halls whispering her name as if it were both prayer and curse. When he pointed a pistol at the mirror, she understood that love, once mistaken for kindness, could become danger in silence. She arranged for his care discreetly, paid his debts, packed her books. Then she did something women like her were not meant to do. She left. She sold the Mount, the house she had designed as her sanctuary. She left its terraces, its symmetry, its memories of discipline and disappointment. She crossed the Atlantic and never came back. "I have shut a door," she told a friend, "which I can never open again." The tone was not grief, it was liberation. In France she bought a small white house, then another, a convent-turned-villa with terraces over the sea. The rooms were narrow, the air sharp with salt and lavender. Here she wrote without disguise. Here she was no longer Mrs. Wharton of Fifth Avenue, but simply Edith, a woman who had survived propriety and made art out of its ruins. She rebuilt her life the way she built her novels, deliberately, symmetrically, with pain as foundation. And just as she began to breathe again, Europe began to burn. The first explosions sounded far away, like thunder on another continent. It was 1914, and Europe was cracking open. Friends urged her to leave France, to return to the safety of New York, but Edith Wharton refused. She had spent her life escaping the prison of drawing rooms. She would not flee now that history itself was demanding courage. When the first wave of refugees poured into Paris, Belgian women, children, old men carrying the remains of their lives wrapped in cloth, she did not weep or faint. She opened her doors. At first it was a single hostel, a few beds arranged in the corner of a borrowed apartment. Then it became a network, workshops for seamstresses, shelters for orphans, a hospital for soldiers with no names left to remember. She coordinated supplies, petitioned ministries, wrote letters to the Red Cross in 3 languages. Her salon became a command post. Action, she said, is the antidote to despair. When German troops approached the Marne, most Americans fled. She went closer. She secured permission to visit the front lines, a request the military granted because they thought her harmless. The irony pleased her. She arrived in a mud-choked trench near Verdun, wearing a simple black coat and a face that gave nothing away. The air reeked of iron and smoke. The ground pulsed beneath her boots. She stepped carefully among the wounded, the dying, the boys with missing hands who still called her Madame. She knelt to one soldier and asked where he was from. He couldn't answer. Half his jaw was gone. She turned away only to breathe, then faced him again. "You are not forgotten," she said. When she returned to Paris, she did not write about heroism. She wrote about logistics, the shape of ruins, the weight of hunger, the way silence followed explosions like a shadow. Her dispatches, published in Scribner's and the Saturday Evening Post, shocked American readers who still imagined the war as a parade. Mrs. Wharton, one editor wrote, describes horror without hysteria. That was her gift. She could count grief without trembling. Within months, she had raised hundreds of thousands of francs. She organized supply routes, opened canteens, argued with generals, comforted children who no longer spoke. Her name began appearing in French newspapers, not as a novelist but as a force. The government awarded her the Legion of Honor. She accepted it quietly and went back to work. To her, medals were for endings. She was still in the middle of things. At night, when the city went dark to avoid air raids, she wrote by candlelight. Fiction returned to her like a fever, hot, dangerous, unstoppable. The story that came out was Summer, written in bursts between ambulance reports and refugee lists. It was her most intimate, most physical novel. No drawing rooms, no corsets of etiquette, just a girl named Charity Royal, poor, impulsive, alive, caught between desire and ruin. If Ethan Frome was frost, Summer was fire. It shocked readers. Critics called it unwomanly, improper, too frank. Edith smiled. At last, she said, they have noticed that women have bodies. Her friends were dying. Henry James, her literary brother, gone in 1916. Walter Berry, her intellectual twin, fading by inches. She did not indulge in mourning. She converted grief into discipline. One must build one's house with whatever stones are left, she wrote to a friend, and she did, literally and metaphorically. Her French villa became her fortress, her command post, her monastery. The pavements outside were streaked with blood and rain. Inside she arranged flowers, wrote reports and mapped fiction like a general planning battles. When the armistice finally came in 1918, the streets of Paris erupted in noise, flags, songs, champagne spilling into the gutters. Edith watched from a window. She didn't celebrate, she had seen too much. The boys she had fed and bandaged were now names carved into stone. The silence that followed victory felt heavier than defeat. So she turned again to the only thing that had ever saved her, writing. The next book came like an exorcism, The Age of Innocence. She said it would be a simple story, but she was lying to herself most of all. She was about to bury an entire civilization. She began it in the winter of 1919, in a house still smelling of disinfectant and salt, surrounded by empty chairs once filled with voices that would never return. The New York she recreated was not memory, it was autopsy. She wrote of gloves and chandeliers, of the suffocating morality of people who believed themselves pure because they were polite. The war had stripped her illusions, now she stripped theirs. Newland Archer, her tragic gentleman, marries the right woman and abandons the right love. He lives correctly and dies quietly. A man who does the right thing, she said, for the wrong reason. It was her verdict on her entire class, and perhaps in some secret way on herself. She had once chosen silence over scandal, form over freedom. Now she turned it into art so exact, It hurt to read. When The Age of Innocence was published in 1920, critics bowed. The same world that once called her cold now called her wise. The book sold in droves, and for the first time she let herself feel pride, not triumph, but vindication. The following year she received a letter from America. She had won the Pulitzer Prize, the first woman in history to do so. She didn't attend the ceremony. She laughed when she learned that the jury had originally chosen Sinclair Lewis's Main Street, only for the board to reject it as too critical of American values. Her novel, they said, upheld the spirit of morality. She closed the letter and said, "They have mistaken irony for piety." Then she placed the medal in a drawer beside a bundle of old love letters and forgot about it. America celebrated her. France honored her. The world called her brilliant. But Edith Wharton, as always, remained slightly apart from everything she had earned. Praise was just another kind of misunderstanding. What she had written was not nostalgia. It was requiem. The Gilded Age she had exposed in her fiction had long since collapsed under its own weight. The marble palaces were hotels now, the brownstones gutted for commerce. The women who once bowed in silence now raised their voices, and perhaps, she thought, that was her only true success. At 60, she was finally free of expectation. She wrote when she wanted, gardened when she didn't, and lived in rooms designed to fit her mind, not society's eye. She no longer needed to be admired. She had built her own myth out of silence, survival, and sentences that cut like glass. And yet, in the quiet of her garden, beneath vines heavy with lavender, she sometimes thought of that first story she had dictated to her nurse as a child, the one her mother had laughed at and burned. She had rewritten it all her life in different forms, every book, every heroine, every ending. A girl told to stay quiet, who learned instead to speak with precision so sharp it silenced everyone else. When the last confetti of victory faded, and Europe began to rebuild its bones, Edith Wharton did not return to America. The war had remade her more than any success ever could. She had seen what civilization looked like without its chandeliers, raw, trembling, honest. The Gilded Age, that polished theater of manners she had spent a lifetime dissecting, now seemed like an old play performed for ghosts. In Paris, she bought a house with pale walls and iron balconies. It was smaller than the Mount, quieter, more deliberate. She called it Pavillon Cologne, after the white doves that nested in its garden. At last, she wrote to a friend, "A house that listens when I speak." The rooms were proportioned to her solitude. The ceilings were high but not grand, the windows framed with pale lace instead of velvet. Every angle was measured, every corridor echoed softly enough to hold thought. She filled the shelves with books instead of silver and replaced portraits with landscapes. Beauty, she said, should not suffocate, it should breathe. In the morning she wrote with the discipline of a soldier. In the afternoons she tended her roses. Visitors came rarely and never unannounced. "I am not lonely," she told one of them. "I am surrounded by silence, and silence has become my most articulate companion." From this sanctuary she kept writing. She published The Glimpses of the Moon, a story of a couple living by charm instead of money, a satire wrapped in silk. Critics called it light and witty. She smiled. Lightness was her camouflage. Beneath the polished dialogue, she was writing about hunger, about the cost of pretending to belong in a world that only measured worth in appearance. Then came A Son at the Front, written during the war but released after. It was slow, meditative, about a father watching his child walk toward death. It sold poorly. Edith didn't care. "It is the only honest book I have written about grief," she said. "Honesty never sells well." She had nothing left to prove. Her contemporaries, James dead, Barry dying, Fullerton vanished, were shadows. The new literary world was louder now. Fitzgerald, Hemingway, Stein, they wrote with jazz in their blood. Edith watched from her garden, amused. She admired their energy, but not their excess. "They write as if youth were a moral virtue," she said. "It is only a phase of blindness." The modernists called her old-fashioned. She called herself finished with illusion. France adored her. The Legion of Honor still glimmered faintly in a drawer. The government consulted her on refugee welfare. Younger writers came to pay respects, some expecting an oracle, others a relic. What they found was a woman who spoke with the calm precision of a scalpel. "Write," she told one young novelist, "until you no longer need to be admired." She had long ago stopped mistaking attention for affection. Yet even in her discipline, loss shadowed her. Walter Berry, the man who had understood her sentences before she finished them, was failing. Their friendship, intellectual, tender, unconsummated, had been the quiet axis of her life. When he died in 1927, she wrote, "All my life goes with him." She asked that her letters to him be buried beside his body. They were. After that, her words changed. The sentences slowed, not weaker, just measured, as if she were counting the beats of her own heart. In the stillness of Pavillon Colombe, she began to write about memory itself. Twilight Sleep was her answer to the modern world, a satire about people who tried to sterilize pain, who thought progress meant forgetting. "We are anesthetizing the soul," she wrote. Critics called it cruel. She called it diagnosis. "I lived among those who thought suffering was bad taste," she said. "Now they have simply made it inconvenient." The novel was not loved, but it was prophetic. In 1929 came Hudson River Bracketed, a long, strange novel about a young writer wandering between the noise of the new and the ruins of the old. It was her confession in disguise. The hero Vance Weston searches for meaning in a world that no longer believes in permanence. He walks through the past, one critic wrote, as if through a museum where the lights are going out. Edith smiled when she read that. "Yes," she said, "and I am the curator." The sequel, The Gods Arrive, followed in 1932. It was dense, imperfect, relentless. A man who glimpses truth but cannot hold it. The book sold little. Reviewers were puzzled. Some called it too reflective, others too slow. Edith shrugged. "Reflection," she said, "is what begins when the world stops looking." She wasn't chasing readers anymore. She was writing for ghosts. Henry, Walter, the girl she once was, the woman she had become. Outside her walls, the world roared again. The 1930s came with radio static, motor cars, and the scent of another war on the wind. The young writers she had once watched in cafes were now the new canon. They drank in Montparnasse and wrote about despair, as if it were fashion. Edith had no contempt for them, only distance. "They believe they invented disillusionment," she said softly. "I merely refined it." Her days settled into a pattern as precise as her prose. She woke at 7, tea, letters, then work until noon. Lunch in the garden, soup, bread, wine. Afternoon revisions. Evenings by the fire with a dog at her feet and a book in her hand. The servants knew to move quietly, even their footsteps seemed edited. "She lives," a guest once said, as if every moment were a sentence she could not afford to waste. Sometimes, on clear mornings, she walked to the edge of a garden and looked toward the horizon. "All the places I have lived," she said once, "still live in me, but the doors are locked." She had no desire to return to New York. "I left before it became America," she said. "Now it is something else entirely." For her, the city of chandeliers and carriages had died the day electric light arrived. She did not age bitterly. She aged like architecture, slowly, beautifully, with cracks that only added meaning. Visitors still came, scholars, admirers, old friends. She received them with kindness, but never nostalgia. "I have written all my goodbyes," she told one admirer. "Now I only reread them." The world called her cold, but those who stayed long enough in her presence understood her quiet was not emptiness. It was the sound of endurance. When evening fell, she often sat by her window, the last light touching the spine of the House of Mirth on her shelf. She would trace the embossed letters with her finger and whisper, "We were both punished for wanting too much." Then she would smile faintly, as if forgiving herself. The silence that had once imprisoned her had become her throne. The winters at Pavillon Colombe grew softer, the light paler, the world beyond her gates dimmer and noisier. Paris hummed with motion, but inside her house time moved like a slow breath. Edith Wharton was now a monument to a century that no longer existed, a relic, yes, but a living one, carved by her own discipline. The war had passed, but its echo stayed in her bones. Her gardens still bloomed, but fewer people came to see them. Those who did found her seated at her desk, still in her writing chair, a small, straight figure in grey, her pen scratching across the paper with deliberate grace. She no longer wrote to be read. She wrote to remember how. The books that came in these years were quieter, more deliberate, like the measured footsteps of someone walking through familiar rooms for the last time. She had spent her life constructing sentences like architecture, each one balanced, weight-bearing, resistant to collapse. Now she built them for herself. "I am not writing for the world," she told a friend. "I am writing to remind myself that I am still here." Her world had grown smaller, but within that smallness there was control, something she had never possessed as a young woman in New York's drawing rooms. Each morning she rose at 7. The curtains opened to pale light, the same way every day, as if the sun respected her schedule. Her housekeeper brought tea. Her dog stirred at her feet. She read a page of Racine or Dante, sometimes both, then took up her pen. She wrote until noon, revised until 2, walked the garden paths at 3. The routine was her cathedral. "A day well ordered," she said once, "is a sentence correctly built." Outside, the world had changed its language. The new writers, the lost generation as they were calling themselves, had made chaos fashionable. They worshipped disorder, spoke in fragments, confessed without shame. Hemingway wrote about courage, Fitzgerald about ruin, Woolf about consciousness itself. Edith read them all. She admired their audacity, but not their impatience. They wished to write without memory, she said, as if the past were a disease. Her past had been her subject, her weapon, her witness. To her, history was not nostalgia, it was anatomy. Still, she felt the ache of distance. Walter Berry was gone. His death had cut through her like quiet lightning, leaving everything outwardly intact but irreparably changed. For decades he had been the voice in her margins, the mirror of her mind. Now she wrote into a silence that did not answer back. "He was the only one," she said softly, "who knew the weight of my sentences." She buried herself in work, but grief for Edith was not something to be spoken. It was something to be revised. Her prose slowed, stretched, became almost architectural in its sorrow. In the late 1920s, she began her final major novels, Hudson River Bracketed and The Gods Arrive, dense, reflective works about creation, exile, and meaning. The critics were divided, but she no longer cared for their verdicts. "A writer who survives her own time," she wrote, "is forced to live among strangers," and yet she kept going, out of habit, out of love, out of the refusal to let silence reclaim her completely. Then came the tremor. It was small. At first, a faint restlessness in her letters, a recognition that the end of the road was visible now. "I have begun to think backward," she wrote to a friend. "It is not nostalgia. It is an audit." She began what she called a backward glance, a memoir not of confession but of architecture. She wanted to build her past the way she had built her houses, with order, proportion, and restraint. She did not intend a backward glance to be a full confession. She was too disciplined for that, too private. She removed the scandals, the heartbreaks, the fury. Morton Fullerton's name never appeared. Teddy Wharton was mentioned politely, as one might mention a chair one had once owned. Her mother was softened, her father forgiven, her childhood polished until it gleamed faintly like porcelain. She was not writing truth. She was writing legacy. "The truth," she said, "has a taste of ashes. I prefer memory." Still, beneath the poise, the reader can hear the echo of longing. Her sentences fold back on themselves like sighs. She describes the rooms of her youth, the carriages, the church pews, the first time she saw Paris, the first time she understood beauty as something dangerous. She recalls her mentors, Henry James, Walter Berry, the ghosts of a vanished class. But more than anything, she recalls the silence. My life, she writes, has been a long apprenticeship to quiet. The memoir was published in 1934. It was elegant, poised and evasive, exactly as she intended. Critics praised its style, lamented its restraint. They wanted scandal, heartbreak, intimacy. Edith offered composition. "I do not explain myself," she told one interviewer. "I have already done that in fiction." After its publication, she slowed. The fountain pen still stood ready, but fewer pages filled the desk. Her strength was waning, though she refused to name it. She still rose early, still worked until noon, still walked her garden paths in the afternoon. But the pace had changed. "Time," she said, "has begun to edit me." Visitors noticed her gentleness now, a quiet warmth that had once been mistaken for coldness. "Age," she said, "has removed the need for defense." The walls of Pavilion Cologne glowed with afternoon light, the roses thick with bees. She often sat by the window, reading or simply watching the light shift. "The silence," she said once, "is not loneliness. It is the sound of my own company." Letters still arrived, from scholars, admirers, old friends. She answered most of them with brevity, sometimes with wit. When one admirer asked for advice on writing, she replied, "Learn to observe everything, forgive nothing, and when you are done, rewrite." When another asked how to balance genius and happiness, she wrote, "Genius survives. Happiness is easily misplaced." Her name was spoken now with reverence, even by those who had once dismissed her. American universities began to study her work. Critics called her the conscience of an era, the woman who had turned manners into moral weaponry. She read those essays with mild amusement. "They mistake endurance for virtue," she wrote in a margin. "It was never that. It was necessity." But beneath the composure there was fatigue. The garden was harder to walk, the pen heavier. Sometimes she would stop mid-sentence and close her eyes, not in pain, but as if seeing something behind the words. "There is a kind of clarity that comes," she said, "when one has nothing left to hide." By 1935, she had mostly withdrawn from public life. The world was changing again. Louder, faster, crueler. Dictators rose. Headlines shouted. She watched the news with quiet dread. "We are rehearsing another tragedy," she murmured. "This time the curtain may not rise again." But she kept her faith in language. "If the world must end," she said once, "let it end in a sentence that still holds." The last photograph taken of her shows her at her desk, pen in hand, sunlight falling on her papers, the faintest smile on her lips. The face is lined but luminous. She is not posing, she is waiting, and even in that stillness, she looks exactly as she always wanted to be remembered, composed, alert, unfinished. The years thinned, and the air in her rooms grew heavy with memory. Edith Wharton moved more slowly now, but her mind remained surgical. Each morning the same ritual, pen, ink, sunlight across the table. Her sentences came in fewer numbers, but each was exact, as if she were chiseling words into marble rather than writing them on paper. "When one has written enough," she said, "the silence begins to sound like punctuation." She no longer lived by the clock of publishing. The rush to print, the applause of reviews, even the tremor of new fame had all lost their shape. What mattered now was clarity. She wrote short essays, reflections, fragments of fiction that would never be finished. She described the play of light on walls, the architecture of solitude, the discipline of restraint. Her writing had always been about the spaces between words. Now it was about the spaces between days. Visitors to Pavilion Cologne found a woman who seemed suspended between worlds, half in memory, half in the present. She greeted them warmly but distantly, her eyes alert, her mind always slightly elsewhere. "You have built your life into sentences," one admirer said to her. She smiled, "and I've lived long enough to watch them outlast their subjects." The world outside her garden walls had grown raw again. The Great Depression had cracked the illusion of permanence. Across the Atlantic, new tyrannies were rising, old certainties collapsing. She read the headlines each morning with weary comprehension. "The world," she said, "never learns the grammar of peace. Yet she kept faith with language. For her, writing was not escape. It was the act of refusing oblivion. In 1932, she finished The Gods Arrive, the last of her major novels. It was a strange, restless book, filled with longing and incompleteness, the work of a woman looking back through a window fogged with her own breath. Critics were puzzled. Some called it sprawling, others found it prophetic. Edith said nothing. She had written it not for them, but for herself, to prove, even at 70, that the mind could still create. When one stops inventing, she told a friend, one begins to vanish. After The Gods Arrive, she did not vanish. She shifted. Her life became quieter, her sentences fewer, her pleasures smaller but sharper. She tended her roses with military precision, correcting the gardeners with the same authority she once reserved for editors. She spent long afternoons in her library, rereading the Greeks, sometimes aloud, just to feel the cadence of discipline again. Language, she said, is the only inheritance that cannot be squandered. And yet, beneath the surface calm, there was melancholy. Walter Berry was gone, Henry James long buried, Morton Fullerton dissolved into memory. The names that once filled her letters were now etched in stone. There is no one left, she wrote, to whom I can speak without rehearsal. She missed conversation, the kind that was not performance but recognition. Her guests still adored her, but she felt their reverence like a wall. They came to pay tribute, not to share thought. The solitude was chosen, but it was not always kind. By 1934, her memoir, A Backward Glance, was complete, and its publication drew a quiet wave of admiration. The critics called it graceful, even stately. Some wished for scandal. Edith gave them style. In private, she called it a garden without weeds. She had removed the pain, the chaos, the flesh, and left behind symmetry. The omissions were deliberate. The truth, she wrote to a confidant, is too untidy for my architecture. Yet sometimes at dusk, her restraint wavered. Her companion and secretary, Anna Bellman's successor, found her one evening staring at a photograph of the Mount. "Do you ever wish to see it again?" the woman asked. Edith shook her head. One should not return to rooms where one's voice has stopped echoing. Still, she spoke of it later in a letter. The house was my first sentence of freedom, and like all good sentences, it closed when its meaning was complete. France had become her refuge, but also her mirror. The quiet villages, the rhythm of seasons, the civility of control, it all suited her temperament. And yet, the rising murmur of war shadowed even her peace. By 1936, she sensed it. The air, she wrote, feels weighted again. Men have forgotten their own fragility. She had seen one war, tended its wounds, counted its ghosts. She dreaded seeing another. But her health was failing, and she knew she would not live to witness it fully. Perhaps, she said, my generation's tragedy has been enough for one lifetime. Her body, once strong from discipline, began to betray her. The doctors called it a stroke. Edith called it an interruption. Her right hand trembled. Her pen slipped. For the first time since childhood, she could not control her own script. She dictated fragments to her secretary, sentences broken by pauses, sometimes forgotten mid-breath. "I cannot bear to think of words waiting for me," she whispered once. "They have always been so patient." Still, she refused to surrender to illness. Even when her hand faltered, she edited. Even when her memory blurred, she corrected proofs, reread drafts, adjusted punctuation. Precision had become her last form of prayer. To make something exact, she said, is to leave one corner of chaos ordered. The last months were marked by stillness. The garden outside her study overflowed with flowers she no longer had strength to tend. She sat near the window, watching sunlight on leaves. "This light," she murmured once, "reminds me of Florence. Everything that mattered began in that light." Her servants moved quietly. Her friends visited sparingly. Her dogs slept at her feet. She was not afraid. "Death," she told one friend, "is simply the end of the sentence." On the morning of August 11th, 1937, the pen slipped from her hand for the final time. She was seated in her chair, facing the garden, a page half covered before her. The window was open, the air full of bees. There was no struggle, no cry, no farewell. Her heart stopped mid-sentence, as if punctuation itself had taken her. She was 75. The news spread slowly, like a whisper through the literary salons of Paris and the polite columns of New York. America gave her a paragraph. France gave her flowers. Her body was buried at Versailles beside Walter Berry, as she had wished. The inscription on the stone was simple: names, dates, and nothing more. The silence she had spent a lifetime sculpting had finally become complete. But her words remained. In the years that followed, readers rediscovered her novels. Scholars claimed her as their conscience. Women found in her restraint a map of resistance. She had written of women who endured quietly, who rebelled in thought, who mastered composure as a weapon. Now, generations later, her stillness read like thunder. When asked once what she hoped to be remembered for, Edith had smiled faintly. For building something that didn't fall, she said. And she had, in marble, in ink, in silence. In the years after her death, Edith Wharton's name faded into polite silence, the same silence she had spent a lifetime dissecting. The world moved on to louder women, noisier revolutions, brighter modernity. The Jazz Age devoured restraint, and her novels, once sharp as glass, were shelved as relics of good manners. Critics called her cold, detached, aristocratic. They mistook precision for privilege, clarity for cruelty. But time, like history, has a talent for revision. By mid-century, the silence around her began to crack. Women scholars reopened her books and found not elegance, but rebellion. Beneath the polished drawing rooms, they saw the autopsies she'd been writing all along, of marriages that strangled, of beauty turned into currency, of women punished for noticing too much. She wasn't writing about luxury, one critic said. She was writing about captivity. The House of Mirth became tragedy, not social commentary. The Age of Innocence became an indictment, not nostalgia. As feminism ripened, so did her ghost. Readers who had once dismissed her as old-fashioned began to recognize her as prophetic. Every quiet woman, every over-controlled daughter, every artist trained to soften her edges could find herself somewhere in Wharton's prose. She had written about obedience like a crime and silence like a wound, and generations later, the wound still bled. In universities, she was reclaimed. In book clubs, she was rediscovered. Filmmakers turned her restraint into atmosphere. Actors delivered her dialogue like confession. And in every adaptation, one truth endured. Edith Wharton had written The Gilded Age not as a glittering empire, but as a fragile disguise. She had lifted the veil, and what she showed was the cost of perfection. Her sentences still gleam, her rooms still echo. The chandeliers may have dimmed, but the women she imagined never left. They linger in mirrors, behind smiles, in every pause between what is said and what is meant. Wharton didn't just expose her age, she diagnosed it, and in doing so she left behind not comfort, but conscience. The woman who was told to sit straight, to be good, to be silent, taught history how to listen. Time has softened the edges of her world, but Edith Wharton still waits in its corners. Her stories whisper through libraries, through film reels and dim lecture halls, through every woman who has ever bitten her tongue instead of speaking her truth. She has become what her society feared most, a woman remembered not for her beauty or her lineage, but for her mind. The Gilded Age she wrote about has turned to dust, but its ghosts are still familiar. The polished cages, the ornamental obedience, the polite erasures, they wear new clothes now, but they live on. Wharton's genius was not in nostalgia, but in prophecy. She knew that every generation would invent its own drawing rooms and teach its women how to survive inside them. She also knew that some of those women would eventually pick up a pen. Her voice remains a contradiction, cool and merciless, yet full of buried ache. She wrote with the precision of an architect and the heartbreak of a witness. Her fiction did not ask to be liked. It asked to be believed. Even now, her words sting because they are true, how easily women vanish into good manners, how silence can become an inheritance, how the cost of belonging is sometimes the soul itself. But in the end, she did not vanish. She endured. Her books still breathe, her sentences still cut, her rebellion still unfolds line by line in the hands of new readers who recognize themselves between her commas. Edith Wharton did not escape her cage. She redesigned it until it became art, and in that transformation, she left the door open for the rest of us. So, as the pages close on this story, listen to the echo she left behind. It's not loud. It never was. It's the quiet sound of a woman refusing to disappear. If this story stayed with you, subscribe to The Untold Woman. Because history doesn't remember its women by accident, we make sure it does. Like, share, and comment below. Was Edith Wharton a rebel disguised as a lady, or a lady who became a rebel by writing? Your voice keeps her legacy alive. Until next time, stay curious, stay defiant, and never stop reclaiming the women the world tried to forget.